Boom, tells me it started, the light's on, everything looks good. All right, so as far as I can tell. All right, so anybody got any questions for me before we go on? We just have a few slides left in this chapter 23, then we get to move on to a really cool chapter where I get to confuse you even more, if you're not confused already enough. Not by the information, but by the concepts. Any questions about this whole idea of variation and how it gets changed and what evolution is, and then where we had led ourselves to, and this is what this last couple slides is talking about, is if you look at it, if you think about it, what we've been discussing, although in lab we saw an indication of how that doesn't happen, but the idea, if there is at a particular time and place on the environment on Earth a particular phenotype that is the most fit of everybody, then you might think that the ones that are least fit would eventually go extinct. Now that does sometimes happen. People who study extinction rates and animals describe this critical minimum size. You might think, well, that's what, one female? Well, it depends. Depending on how animals reproduce, mortality rates, a bunch of factors that you factor in, you get a number, and it says when the population drops below this number, then extinction is inevitable. It's like being on a side of a mountain. Once you get a little bit too far, you're over the edge and you can't stop yourself from falling. And that number is hotly debated depending on how you look at those parameters. So yes, things obviously do go extinct. It's not maybe it's not as common that way. In other words, being outcompeted by members of your own species. It's more common like maybe you get outcompeted by another species. Predators move in and kill off everybody, okay? Or asteroid hits the planet. But all right, so what we're talking about here is what maintains variation. In other words, is one thing is the most fit. Why are there others out there, right? Makes sense. If one way is the most fit phenotype, then why are the others even existing? Well, not because Mother Nature has any intent in this. Remember, this is all random. But remember, one of the things I talked about is the fact that we're diploid. And we take that for granted, that organisms are diploid, but they're not. Our first group of plants that we get into, the mosses, they're not diploid. When you walk around in the forest and you see a big green mat of moss, that thing you see, that structure, is made of cells that are only haploid. Only have half the number of chromosomes. Nothing says life has to be diploid. Nothing says it has to be at all. Diploid is nice because you get recessive alleles, and if those recessive alleles are bad, they can be hidden. If those recessive alleles may hold some future, that's the key word there, future benefit, then being diploid is beneficial. So you carry this recessive allele that doesn't show itself, or maybe shows itself just a little bit, and then because of something that happens in the environment, right? Because of something that occurs in the environment, having that recessive allele all of a sudden becomes important. Now, I think an example will help you understand that better, so I will talk about that when I get to it. All of these are together under balancing selection. I'm sorry, the way the slide is outlined, it actually should be, these are two parts of it, because they're one fits into the other. In balancing selection, polymorphism, what we're talking about, that's what balancing selection is all about, maintaining many forms. Natural selection keeps this stable frequencies, stable in the sense of over time, not necessarily stable each month or each year, but over time it stabilizes. So one phenotype might get in greater quantity for a few years, and then the other one, or maybe in a few weeks, but it's like the seesaw thing, right, back and forth. All right, let's look at two examples of how this is done. Let's look at two examples how we don't end up with just the greatest, best, most fit organisms out there. Why do we have this these variability? Why do we have these other types if really only one type is the best, right? Well, okay, let's take a look at this. This is something called heterozygote advantage. In other words, this is only going to be applicable to organisms that are diploid. If you're haploid, you can't be heterozygous or homozygous or any of that kind of stuff, right? You only got one set of chromosomes. But among us diploid critters out there, among us organisms that spend a good portion of our lives as diploids, we can be heterozygous. It doesn't mean that you are, right? It means, for example, you could be homozygous dominant. But I'm talking about these guys. Remember the other day in class we figured out how to number them, as a matter of fact. Remember, that was the 2PQ of the Hardy-Weinberg that we played with. Make sure you take a look at those Hardy-Weinberg problems and start working on those. There's a number of them, but I gave you a lot of them because I found that the more practice, and especially if you follow that flow chart that I gave you, the more practice, the better you get at them. They're not difficult to do, but they're easy to get confused, so that's why practice helps. All right, back to heterozygote advantage. Up at the top, if you're wondering what this collection of pictures is all about, up at the top involves some critters that we're actually going to talk about in more detail in the future, but you're very familiar with, our buddy, the blood-sucking mosquito. Now, it's not just mosquitoes, but there are many other critters out there that do that. Fleas can be this way, and many other types of insects, but these are organisms that can transmit, and mostly when we talk about transmit, we're talking about disease. These are things we call vectors. Mosquitoes are vectors. The reason why they're vectors is they can transmit a disease from one organism to another, a blood disease. For example, in the disease malaria, all right, malaria, which actually came from the Latin word bad air. Malaria used to be associated with breathing bad air. Okay, well, it's not that really. Okay, malaria is a protozoan, which we haven't talked about protozoans yet, but the protozoan actually is a red blood cell parasite, or it's a parasite in its host, and it affects your liver as well and your red blood cells. As a matter of fact, in this picture right here, under a microscope, and you'll see some of these in the lab. Actually, I have some cool pictures of this. These are red blood cells. Come on, there we go. These are red blood cells, and this one right here is a red blood cell that's infested with a stage of this parasite. This parasite goes through many different stages in its host. Part of that stage occurs in the liver. Part of that stage occurs in your red blood cells, and part of that stage occurs in the stomach of the mosquito. There's the important part. That's the connection between us and the mosquito. All right, what's the mosquito need to do? All right, first of all, mosquito lands on you and injects his proboscis. It's right. I think that's it right there. Is that a hair? It's right about up in here, this region. A small little needle-like thing into your skin. Oh, by the way, the reason why sometimes you don't feel a mosquito biting you, I mean, sometimes you do, especially the ones out on, oh gosh, at the beach at night, they can bite you through your jeans. I mean, they're nasty, right? But one of the ways that they minimize you feeling being bitten is they've looked at it microscopically, and mosquito proboscis, jabber, the thing they stick into you, it's not like a pin. It's actually more, it's serrated a little bit. I can't draw serrations, but you get the idea, right? It's like a steak knife. Boy, that's awful, Steve. But nonetheless, they believe that shape, that microscopic serration steak knife, lessens your ability to feel them sticking it into you. That's kind of macabre, but you get the idea, right? So they're thinking, well, maybe if we designed immunization needles that way, they wouldn't be as painful, right? All right. So anyway, the proboscis is injected into you, however way it's done. Now it's a blood parasite. Look at that big stomach filling up with blood. Your blood is its food. Now, blood has a natural tendency not to flow, right? It coagulates, it clots. That prevents you from bleeding to death from cutting yourself shaving. But the mosquito's getting around that. The way blood coagulates, it uses these things called platelets. Now, if you go on and you take A&P, you'll learn a lot about platelets. But platelets are in your blood cells, and what they do is they're basically like, caulking, I guess. They plug up holes. So if you get shaving and you cut yourself, it plugs up that hole, so you bleed for a while, then you form a scab and it heals, and you all know the routine. Well, so blood wants to coagulate. So when the mosquito sticks his proboscis into you, the first thing so some red blood cells down here, the first thing they want to do, they're supposed to be round, but it's hard to draw on an angle, is coagulate. Oh my goodness, there's a hole in the capillary. Even though it's a real small hole, we want to plug it up. And the mosquito's like, ugh, this would be like trying to drink a really frozen milkshake through a straw. That's a doggone good analogy. You guys understand what I mean? You get your milkshake and it's brand new, just had it made, it's still really cold, and you're pulling on the straw. What usually do you get? You guys ever drink milkshakes? Cooper's never had one, so I don't think he can answer to this. Plus, he's snoring right now. You guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah, you can pull it out, you get nothing, right? You wait till it warms up. It's got to be more liquidy. Yeah. So what does the mosquito do? Before he sucks blood out, he injects a little bit of a substance that is an anticoagulant. Certain organisms and even in medicine, we have things that are anticoagulants. Somebody might have stroke problems, blood clot problems. You would want to give them something that actually prevents the blood from or not prevents, but maybe minimizes this blocking tendency. If you're somebody who makes a lot of blockages. Certain species of organisms that may want you to bleed to death, like Komodo dragons. There's a good way to bring that into it. Komodo dragons like to bite their prey and then let their prey crawl off and die and then come eat them later. It's easier to eat something after it's dead than to try to eat it while it's trying to stay alive. Sorry to start your morning with a story like that. You know that happens, but the point is, what you're doing is you're trying to get the organism to bleed. So the mosquito, like a Komodo dragon, might have some materials in it that is an anticoagulant, prevents your blood from clotting. Now, mosquito does have that anticoagulant, plugs it into your capillaries, and then injects a little bit of that anticoagulant into you first, loosens the blood up, and then takes a blood meal. Mosquito flies off, and then, of course, lives, fine for a while, and of course needs another blood meal. We'll get back to the mosquito in a second, but let me go back to the mosquito bite. The itching you feel, just got bit by a mosquito, is because your body is having an allergic reaction to the stuff the mosquito injected into you to get your blood to the anticoagulant, to get your blood not to clot. That's what the itching is. Your immune system, it's something foreign, and we all know what your immune system does when it recognizes something foreign. It attacks it, and one of the ways it does is it produces things called histamines, and histamines make you itch, among other things. Okay, now, back to our buddy the mosquito. Mosquito's flown off with your blood. Let's say, we got to start somewhere, but let's just say you have malaria. Some of those red blood cells that mosquito ingested would have included those little parasites that I pointed out to you, wouldn't it, right? Perfect, because the parasite is actually evolved to need the mosquito's stomach to continue to develop. Now, therefore, the mosquito or the parasite develops in the mosquito's stomach, turns into a mature larval stage. They have many larval stages. Mosquito flies onto your buddy. Guess what? Your buddy wants to clot his blood as well, just like you. So the first thing the mosquito has to do is inject a little bit of that anticoagulant into your buddy. Guess what else is in that anticoagulant? Yes, it's mostly anticoagulant, but there's a little bit of blood because it's coming out of his mouth. And guess what is in some of that blood that the mosquito is now injecting into your buddy? And so therefore we have a vector, don't we? Right? The mosquito takes a little bit of blood out of you. Maybe some of those red blood cells have those purple things. He lands on your buddy, injects a little bit of blood into him as well as that anticoagulant. Guess what? You now have the parasite. And you now have malaria. Interesting, right? I guess unless you have malaria. Malaria is a pretty serious disease, kills off a lot of the population. As a matter of fact, in Africa, they do a lot of charitable organizations trying to provide nets. There's actually one called Nothing But Nets for folks in Africa, mosquito nets to cover over them to keep the mosquitoes off of them. We would have a problem here in Florida, but we've eradicated for the most part the mosquito population. Development, habitat destruction, not so good for the mosquitoes, but certainly good for us and things like that. But the Zika virus is an example that mosquitoes are still vectors in other diseases. Okay, now, sickle cell anemia, you remember from Bio 1, was actually a pretty simple kind of mutation. You remember we called it a point mutation. It was a point mutation. Actually, I talked about this a couple of slides ago. Because it was just one base that changed. But anyway, the end result is you change the phenotype. Red blood cells are normally round and stretchy and spongy, and folks with sickle cell anemia have some, many, a few, it varies, of sickled red blood cells. Now, sickled red blood cells don't hold as much oxygen, number one. That's the anemia part, so it needs to be anemic. And they stick together and form clumpy blood, which gets caught. It especially gets caught in the smaller little blood vessels and the smaller capillaries. And just like having a blood clot, that's not a good thing. Folks from malaria, especially really bad forms of malaria or really intense forms, acute forms, don't live very long. Let me say that again. Don't live very long. Right? That should be little light bulbs coming off in your head. Okay. All right. Now let's take a look. This is some cool detective work. I use that phrase a lot because science is like that. It's like peeling away onions. Here's the continent of Africa, and we've got two things that are plotted. We've got the incidence of sickle cell anemia. Excuse me. And you can see that obviously its highest rate is in what we call tropical Africa, right? 10 to 20%. It diminishes in the middle part of Africa where it tends to get a little higher. The elevation increases, and then it diminishes further beyond that. Any idea, speaking about environment, why would you think that, well, yeah, okay, you know the connection. That's right. I just gave it to you, the sickle cell and the mosquito. Why do we find higher rates of sickle cell anemia in these really wet tropical places here? Here, this is a place too, whereas this is still kind of tropical, but it's higher elevation, a little bit drier. Why do you think the dark red areas would have higher rates of sickle cell anemia? Just think about where you live and what we deal with these little critters. Cooper? Oh, no. He's still asleep. Sorry, it's going to have to be one of y'all then. Desiree Marie, what do you think? Why is sickle cell anemia? Remember, it's something to do with the mosquito. So why do you think there's higher rates in those areas that I just pointed out? Those areas where we would find tropical wet or very tropical, very wet climates versus the other ones that are somewhat less. What do mosquitoes need to reproduce? They're much like amphibians that way. In the Zika virus, they told everybody to go around to your and dump the water out of your tires. Why was that? What do mosquitoes need to reproduce other than each other? There you go. So you're going to find a lot of them in those kinds of areas, aren't you? So a little bit of detective work. It's kind of like critical analysis. Looking at that, that's the same thing that folks who figured this out. This is a really cool branch of science or medicine called hope I spell it right, epidemiology. If you're interested in that, epidemiology is the study of why diseases are the way they are and how they spread. So folks who would do this would be epidemiologists. If that's kind of interesting to you, let me know, because one of our professors actually has a lot of experience in that. He could talk to you about fields in that if that's something interesting to you. But all right, now back to more of the detective work, the epidemiology. The hash lines indicate the distribution of the mosquito. The mosquito, there's its scientific name, is called Plasmodium falciparum. Don't worry about that word right now. You're going to see it again when we start talking about protozoans and that sort of stuff. But notice where those mosquitoes are found. No surprise, they're found in areas that's wet and swampy, although they're found in some areas as well. And for other reasons, the areas that don't have the red in them can be explained why you don't see higher rates of sickle cell anemia. There's a lot more to this story than I'm giving you, but so I don't want to get too deep because I don't want to get too far off into details that are interesting but not necessarily important to understanding this, because we're talking about heterozygote advantage. All right, so let's write out the three genotypes. You do not have sickle cell anemia. You do not carry sickle cell anemia. You make normal round red blood cells. You do have sickle cell anemia. It's a recessive disorder. You're homozygous recessive, therefore a varying degree, and if you have it really bad, lots of your red blood cells become sickle shaped. There is one more though, right? This guy. Heterozygote advantage. Now here's the thing being heterozygote. When you're heterozygote for sickle cell anemia, and it varies along a degree as well, maybe a few of your red blood cells become sickle shaped, maybe a few more. You see what I'm trying to say? Between these two, the carrier, that's what you are when you're heterozygous, heterozygous, and the other one, the degree of sickle cell anemia can vary. Now, when you truly are homozygous recessive, you reach the degree in which it's a problem. If you're a carrier, it kind of depends. A football player, Philadelphia Steelers, cornerback, I believe. Ray Clark was the fellow's name. I think I only remember that because my last name was a football player from Philadelphia, traveled to a game in Denver, higher altitude, and suffered, I think he had to have his spleen removed, which is often what happens in folks with sickle cell anemia. But he felt symptoms. He almost died. Now, I don't remember if he knew he was a carrier or not, or found it out right then. But one of the things that folks who are carriers have problems with is at higher altitudes. All right, at higher altitude with less oxygen, if you're a carrier, your problem, however minimum it is, gets a little worse. That's why he may not have experienced it before that. I think the young kid who died at UCF, the football player, was the same thing. I believe in this case he didn't know he was a carrier, and heavy exertion, right? Football practice, low oxygen levels, same idea. All right, now, finally going to tie this all together. I think that's such a neat story. That's why I put that all in there. But I'm finally going to tie this all together. Why it says heterozygote advantage. It's all about numbers. Remember I told you about this idea of living longer. All right, now, if you're homozygous dominant, let me erase my scribble. If you're homozygous dominant, you're not going to die of sickle cell anemia, okay? But you are going to die of malaria. Or not going to, but there's a good chance that malaria is going to get you. If you have sickle cell anemia, then it's not the malaria so much, but it's the sickle cell anemia that's going to shorten your life. Same thing for those that are homozygous dominant. Malaria is going to shorten your life. Sorry about that. Now, heterozygote advantage. Check this out. If you are a carrier for sickle cell anemia, and especially true if, let's say, you're a little bit of a carrier, you also have a resistance. Now, here's the climax of the story. You have a resistance to malaria. Whatever it is, I'm sure you can get online and figure it out, but being a carrier for sickle cell anemia makes it more difficult for the parasite to affect your red blood cells. It might be something to do with it. They can infect sickle-shaped red blood cells or something like that. It's something about their life cycle. I need to look into that, but I haven't. But so what happens numbers-wise? Okay, if you have sickle cell anemia, you live X amount of time, and many times malaria kills you. Let's say your average lifespan is 25 years. That seems low, but whatever, it's a good number. If you have sickle cell anemia, you will live a while, but let's say your average lifespan is 20 years, okay? 20 years. And also because you're sick a lot, because when you have full-blown sickle cell anemia, you're often sick. You just don't die of it overnight. You probably are not real reproductively active, let's say. And maybe even you could say the same thing for the malaria folks up above. When you're sick with malaria, you certainly don't want to think about sex, right? But now, those that are heterozygotes, they're not going to feel the effects of malaria necessarily as much. They're not going to feel the effects of sickle cell anemia as much. So while they may be sick a little bit, and sometimes, guess what? Overall, in this horrible world they live in with sickle cell anemia, or I'm sorry, with sickle cell anemia and malaria, they might live 35 years. And since they're not sick as much, right, with sickle cell anemia or with malaria, and they live 35 years, guess who probably makes the most offspring of those three genotypes? Would it be the homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or do you think it would be the heterozygote? Now remember our water strider that we talked about the other day. It's not just about how long you live or how many offspring you make, but it's really together, isn't it? How many offspring you make times how long you live. So do you see what I mean by a heterozygote having an advantage here? Do you relate that back to what we talked about in Darwin's theory, about the fittest and this important concept, right? Important of differential reproductivity, right? I'll write that down one more time. See how that all fits together there? Does that make sense? Y'all have any questions on that? So what that means in terms of balancing selection, you're never going to get rid of that sickle cell anemia allele, okay? Because in some cases, it provides an advantage, a little bit. You don't need a lot. Now, to take this story one more, and then I'll stop there. This also explains why we typically find sickle cell anemia and sickle cell anemia trait among folks from these areas of the world historically, ethnically. Sickle cell anemia tends to be higher among folks in tropical Africa and a little bit along the Mediterranean as well. Okay, so it has a lot to do with what human behavior. Ethnicities tend to breed with other ethnicities, members of the same ethnicity, at least initially, because if you're growing up in tropical Africa in 1682, you didn't really have much way to go someplace else to find some. You might go over to the next village, but you're not going to get too far away to find a mate, right? All right, does that make sense? Okay, here's another way. I hinted this the other day because this is something we were actually talking about when we were looking at our bean lab. In the red is kind of the sum of what this whole graph says. A rare has the advantage. This is what we call frequency-dependent selection. And that word basically tells you is you get selected for. I don't really like to say selected against. It's not really that way, but it is. But you get selected for, or you don't. Maybe I should say it that way. You don't get selected for based on how much you are in the population. And what I mean by you, I mean you variant. All right, water boatman. That's what that insect is right there. Come in 3 colors: dark, medium, and light. And fish like to eat water boatmen, but in order to eat them, they must see them. Okay. So now, if there were camouflage involved in this might change the results. But here's the situation. Look down below. If there are a lot of a particular color, like say, let's look at this dot right here. These are dark brown water boatmen. If there are a lot of dark brown water boatmen, was that about 50? Then you see the number that are taken by fish is somewhere almost close to 80%. See that right there? If there are fewer dark brown water boatmen, there's about 20, they're taken about 20% of the time. All right, you see what I'm saying is going on here? So if you are, let's say, a dark brown water boatman, but you're one of few, you're one of these guys down here, the thing that's going to happen is you're going to reproduce. Everybody gets to reproduce, right? We talked about that before. Everybody gets to reproduce. But since there's few of you, there's only a handful of you dark brown water boatmen, there's not going to be very many offspring. Numbers. It's all math. It's all arithmetic, really, right? But if you're one of those, let's say, light brown ones, and there's lots of you in the environment, then guess what? You're going to make lots of offspring. Now, if you're thinking, oh, this is kind of, that's supposed to be a circle, by the way. This is kind of what we saw with the red and the blue beads, you remember? Because remember through time we did that summary chart that even though, let me get this right, the blue always survived better, it was becoming less better. Oh, and the red one survived worse, but it was becoming less worse. Do you remember that's not even a word, but you know what I'm saying, right? The proportions were changing. We actually saw frequency-dependent selection. Frequency-dependent selection says if there's a lot of you in the population, right, then that means when a predator comes through, especially many times because predators like fish, got my words mixed up, engage in a very simple behavior pattern we call a fixed action pattern, FAP. FAP is basically every time an animal encounters stimulus X, it's a knee-jerk reaction. That's the best way to explain it. So basically, when there's a lot of light brown or medium brown or dark, who's ever the most in the population, fish get fixated on I eat light brown water boatmen. I eat light brown water boatmen. So not only are there a lot more to eat from, but they're focusing on them. They might be ignoring the dark and the medium, which changes, right? Because remember, back to our dark brown water boatmen, there's not very many of them. They're reproducing a little at a time. The light brown ones, there's lots of them. They're reproducing a lot, but guess what? They're also getting eaten a lot. Remember, it's the environment. The environment is predation here. So the light brown water boatmen are making a lot, but their numbers are diminishing because the fish are going, oh my God, it's a smorgasbord. It's a golden corral of water boatmen here, man. It's all you can eat. And so their numbers decrease, and maybe the medium or the dark brown water boatmen now become the ones that are most in the population. And the fish start going, because they're fish, right? Okay, now I eat only dark brown ones, right? Fixed action pattern, very simple thought process. That's what I mean by rare having the advantage. That means one doesn't always disappear. Isn't that cool? I got one more interesting little bit of detective work too. You might be surprised to know that there are some fish out there that actually live on the scales of other fish. Now, I don't mean live on physically. I mean live on nutritionally. They eat the scales. They'll go up to fish, and scales are kind of like skin. They get sloughed off in animals sometimes. So they'll go find a loose one, or maybe one that's not so loose, and they'll grab it and they pull it off. Now, does the fish like that? Well, no. Imagine, for one thing, it hurts. It's like, grabbing a nose hair and pulling it. Oh, I don't know. That hurts pretty good. Brings tears to your eyes. But, and also, scales can be replaced, but they're also a protective covering. And you don't want to lose much or too much of that protective covering. So fish have to defend themselves against these fish that like to swim up and grab a scale and swim off. You're like, ow, doggone it, I remember once I was in the water, I have a mole on my back, and I was sitting there, oh my God, a small bass had swam up and nipped my mole on my back, thinking it was an insect, I guess. Just because they're small, doesn't mean they've got strong teeth. Okay, so here we are. Now, interesting. Oh, God, Mother Nature is so cool. I don't remember the genus name of these two fish at the top, but these ones that are in the gray, they are scale eaters, right? And Mother Nature has adapted them. Now, these are both the same species to either be left or right mouth. So their mouths, turn to the left or they turn to the right, which is a lot easier, right? When you're swooping in on that brown fish to grab a scale, you don't have to twist. You have to swim up and go, You just kind of swim up and go, Your mouth is right in the right position. So guess what happens? If you look at this at the chart down below, this is what, 81 to 90? So what's that? 9 years. Over 9 years, what biologists did is they tracked the number of left-mouthed individuals, okay, and they also tracked the birth rate of the left-mouthed individuals. Now, the number is the red line going up and down. The green is the birth rate. I don't want to look at the birth rate. It says the same thing, but I just want to focus on one of these. Look at the left-mouthed individuals back in 1981. They were a little bit more than 50%. So let's say 58% were left-mouthed, and what's the difference? 42% were the other type. So what I'm trying to say is the left-mouthed ones were the most frequent in the population. Not by much, but they were. So just like those fish that get fixated on water boatmen, brown water boatmen, the fish that are getting picked on, the brown one, is knowing that most of the time the attack is going to come from its right by a left-mouthed P. microlepis, whatever P stands for. Again, I don't remember. Okay, so they're going to be more apt, on a fish, to defend to their right. It's always coming from the right, or most always coming from the right. So what's that mean for the right-mouthed ones, the ones that can come in from the left? If I'm always looking to the right, or most often defending to the right, you can sneak in. Can you see me here? I'm going this way. You can sneak in and grab a scale. So guess what happens after a while? You're grabbing more scales. These guys on the right are grabbing fewer scales because I'm dissuading them, or I'm interfering with them, and the other guys are getting more scaled, and they're getting stronger, and they're getting more access to a resource. And ding, 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 Darwin is going off at this point, right? Because they're getting more access to a resource. Their reproductive rate is going up. And guess what happens after a while? There are now more of these guys on the left or on the right, so the fish starts defending the other way, okay? It's hard to balance and watch this screen at the same time. You understand what I'm saying? So we never get rid of the left or the right mouth, because the left or the right mouth are their own selective pressure. They're their own worst enemy. Oh, God, that's perfect. That's good. They're their own worst enemy, because as they become more and more dominant in the population, because they're picking off scales, left and right, and start reproducing more, that's the green dots there, folks, then the fish is in the environment as well, start saying, man, there's a lot of these right mouth P. microlepis, so I better be looking to the left a lot, while the left mouth ones go, yeah, sure, be looking over there because I'm coming this way. Whew. Any questions on that? Oh, God, that's incredible. I love that kind of stuff. All right, one more slide. So in the end, if someone says to you, which I hear sometimes, well, my goodness, if evolution is supposed to make these organisms adapted, how come we don't have a perfect critter? All right, now here's your answers for someone like that. For one thing, you need to take an evolution class, and here's why. Number one, where we are today is a reflection of where we've been. Evolution is limited by the past. You can't go back and start over again. For example, and this might be one of those old wives' tales, but I've heard sometimes that engineering-wise, the way the human knee is formed and the way the human back is formed, because we were tree critters who went to walking upright, bipedal, actually, engineering-wise, the knee and the back were prone to problems. And oftentimes humans, we do have knee and back problems that if we could go over and start over again, we could design a better structural system than what we have now. It's kind of hard to say because, you know, it's predicting what didn't happen. But I've heard that from some engineer types. But basically, you get the idea, right? And the bottom one kind of says the same thing in this chart. Lamarckism, right? You can only, like my dad used to always say, you got to dance with the one that brought you. I get some old thing from Texas, right? You got to dance with the one that brought you. All right, now. Adaptions are compromises. And I remember my 8th grade teacher, government teacher, his last year of school was that my 8th grade. He was retiring and moving to Costa Rica. He said, on a teacher's salary, I'm going to live like a king down there. Anyway, and he always told us that compromise is the most important word to be used in government. Okay? But among evolution, among critters that are trying to adapt, now this is obviously evolution by Darwinism, by natural selection, not drift, not those other ones, right? You don't get perfection from a compromise. If you compromise, you don't get everything you want. If you say, well, if you're going and you're buying a car, you want $2,000, I'll give you $1,800, I'll give you $1,900. Neither one of you got what you wanted. You wanted to pay $18, they wanted to pay $2, right? So you get the idea there. So you can't have perfection when you have something like that. Remember, there we go, drift. So this part isn't talking about Darwin's theory. Drift, sometimes you're not adaptive. Sometimes the change we see is not adaptive. It's just organisms that are lucky. Founder effect, genetic drift, bottleneck, all that stuff that we talked about. Remember, very importantly, in the founder effect, too, when an organism, say, jumps to an outlying island, the initial change in the frequencies, don't confuse those, folks. Folks always seem to think, oh, well, they went to the island and they lived. They lived by luck. Initially, if they continue to survive and reproduce and flourish and so on, then they've adapted. So in this case, we actually have first evolution by genetic drift, and then, if successful, probably not, but if successful, then you begin to adapt. Right? Don't confuse the fact of what happened initially to the changes in the allelic frequencies. I already talked about Lamarckism, right? You can't wish an allele into existence. You can't say, man, I wish I could fly, because if I did, I would. That's the critter I would want to be. I'd want to be a bird. A smart bird. I guess I'd have to be a raptor then. All right, any questions on that chapter? That's it for, what, chapter 23, right? We'll switch over to 24 now. No questions? Y'all still there, right? Cooper? Well, he's still sleeping. Thank you, Marie. Desiree, you still there? I hope that I don't lull people to sleep when I do this, but I know that it's hard sometimes. I've done meetings like this that, it's not quite the same as being human to human, but nonetheless, it does provide the benefit, right? It provides the flexibility, which is what we're trying to do, because y'all are very busy people. So sometimes it's difficult to make your way to a classroom. So I think this is the wave of the future. So keep working with me on this and in future classes, right? The more interaction, the better. Yeah, I know. That's one of the problems too. You know, that's what, when they first rolled this program out, they said, look, you can see all the images of your students. So years ago, when I first started, I had everybody turn on their cameras. Oh boy, what a mess. The lag and the internet, you can't. I mean, what's nice on paper isn't always nice, right? Okay, chapter 24, we take a major leap, folks. So far, all we've talked about are wildebeests getting faster, or rabbit ears getting longer, or finches adapting to different nuts and different seasons on the Galapagos Islands, like you see in the picture there. Well, there's 13. That's an old picture. I think we're now at 15 or even 17 different, different finches, different species of finches. So that's where chapter 4. That's what I mean by a big leap. We haven't jumped out of the population realm yet. Remember, the thing that evolves is the population. Individuals don't evolve, the population does. But now with this chapter, what we're going to do is, how do two or more populations of the same species genetically separate themselves until they become separate species? So how did that original, if Ernst Mayr said it, maybe it was a single fertilized female bird that made it to the Galapagos? Probably not, but it was a few. How did that few of that original species A, the motherland species, how did that become the 15 or 17 species that we see now today, right? When they made it over the island, how did that happen? That's our question here in chapter 24. Now, if you want to look at it on a really grand scale, I love this chart. Right? It looks like a branch. So here's where we are going up in time. This is the universal common ancestor, UCA. We call it the universal common ancestor. In other words, everything on Earth is related to this. And you notice the dashed line, which indicates, well, I'm not really sure exactly how that came about. And then just as an example, as we move forward in time, as we move up the y-axis, we get more and more species, right? This is the tree of life. This is the diversity. This is the depiction of how species arose. And when we get to the top, these species that make it to the top are around, so they're extant, right? And the ones that don't make it to the top, these guys here, my pen's decided to die. These guys here and here, they're our extinct, right? These guys here are closely related. They're more closely related to each other than they say they are to this guy, right? You see how that works? It's just a family tree, right? That's all. Let me get rid of my scribbling. Just a family tree. We follow up the family tree. We follow up the family tree, and when we get to a point in time, your grandparents had you, your parents had you. It's the same thing. It's the same thing if you're doing a family tree, a pedigree, right? So what we're going to be talking about in chapter 24, like I said, this big jump from 23. In 23, we talked about something called microevolution. I showed you that word before when we were doing the Hardy-Weinberg stuff. Evolution at the population level, right? So we're going to go from microevolution to macroevolution, all right? Macro, and it's a wide, very wandering, random kind of route, sort of like, this guy stumbling around on a boat, making from one place to the other. And in macroevolution, we're talking about how do we get a new genus? How do we get these new species? How do we get new families? How did that universal common ancestor, this is so mind-blowing to me, how did that universal common ancestor, whatever it was, end up creating fungi and protozoans and all the different prokaryotes and the mammals and the reptiles and the dinosaurs and and all those things that are at the top of the tree. Now, even all those ones that went extinct, how did all that diversity come out of that? Slowly. That's for one thing I know. Slowly. Really slowly. How did the river cut through the Grand Canyon? Slowly. Remember, that's the key word here, slow. The Earth is really, really, really old. Even life is 3.5 billion years old. None of this happens overnight. I mean, relatively, maybe the asteroid thing happened instantly, but the extinction didn't happen overnight, although it did happen pretty quick. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about. How do we get this evolution beyond the species level? In a sense, how do we create different species? So instead of just making longer-eared rabbits, how do we make rabbit species A, and then all of a sudden now we have rabbit species B, or maybe we have A, B, and C. Maybe we have them all. Okay. This whole chapter, origin of species, is incumbent on us knowing that word species. What's that mean? We have to know. Now, I know you're going to go, what do you mean species? I'll spend a whole chapter. I know what a species is. A cat is a species. A dog is a species. You might even know that different cats, lions are a species, and tigers are a different species, and all that sort of stuff. But you're going to find out that the branch in the family tree has a lot to do with where you are on the tree at the time you're looking at it, right? Now, before I go on, I want to put a couple of very interesting quotes up here. These go back to our first lectures with Aristotle. The scale of nature, right? That ladder, nothing's in between. T.H. Huxley, that's in the parentheses there, was what we call, he was Darwin's bulldog. Basically, Darwin was a bit more mild-mannered. T.H. Huxley was another scientist who was very open. He was the one that would argue at the scientific meetings. He was the one that get up and throw down with folks who were discounting Darwin's theory. Not to say that Darwin didn't defend it either, but Huxley was very vocal. That's why we call it Darwin's bulldog. He wrote, you can read the source there. He wrote that if these gaps between the fossil record, or these gaps between groups of bears and fungi, let's really be wide, if bears and fungi, if you could show that those gaps were always there, the bears were always bears, fungi were always fungi, and never were they the same, never did they share a common ancestor, never did they share that would destroy Darwin's evolutionary theory. Completely destroy it. If you think back to Aristotle, that's what he's talking about. If Aristotle's right, if everybody's on a rung of the ladder, there's nothing in between, Darwin's theory cannot work. Okay? Now, Darwin's theory does work, so obviously, you know, as time has went on, we've added. Now, Darwin's theory was right out of the gun. Now, what has been changed is some of the nuances and some of the tweaking and some of the deeper aspects of it that he didn't understand, which we'll talk about today. But this whole idea of natural selection has not been discounted. This is the way it works. Now, down below, though, we read about how Darwin, even being a good scientist, even coming up with this brilliant idea, always had doubts. I think sometimes we lose the fact that scientists in society are humans too, that we always have doubts, even no matter how much we feel strongly about a theory or a hypothesis, or especially a theory, we always keep the door open. That's why we never say you prove or disprove something, you support or refute. It's a word game, but it's important to know psychologically that the idea among scientists is you're never sure if you're right. So you're always looking. Stephen Jay Gould, who was around during our time, I can't remember if Stephen Jay Gould just died, but he's a contemporary of ours during this time. He wrote that among Darwin had was very disturbed by something called the Cambrian explosion. There wasn't really an explosion, but about 520 million years ago, when we look at the fossil record, we go from very few species. You remember Lamarck and his fossils, right? We go from very few species to almost, relatively speaking, overnight, a bunch of species. Among the animals, for example, before this Cambrian explosion, before this 500 million years ago, there were sponges, some jellyfish, really sort of simple critters. After the explosion, in a period of just about 20 million years, okay, I wouldn't want to stand on my head for 20 million years, but relatively speaking, in about 20 million years, most all the major groups of animals today, including us, including the backboned chordates and including the, well, no, I don't know. Yeah, well, maybe a little bit after that. But anyway, the worms and the arthropods and all those, in a short period of time, boom, they're right there in the fossil record. Holy cow, where'd those all come from? See, Darwin's theory of evolution is correct, natural selection, but one of the things he didn't understand about it is that there can be minor changes to the speed at which it works. Now, I'm not arguing against gradualism back in the geologists. The geologists were saying that the speed of the process of erosion and mountain building stays the same overall. It doesn't mean that it's always very slow. Sometimes during an earthquake, two big plates go and move. I mean, when the San Andreas Fault slips over there in California, it'll move 7, 8, 9 feet. That's a pretty good movement for two big giant chunks of the earth. Okay, so it's all this relative kind of thing. All right, so when we go back into time, we see that evolution at times, relatively speaking, can move very quickly. Darwin was not quite aware of that and didn't have enough evidence of that. So when he looked at the Cambrian explosion, he's like, oh, God, is there something wrong with my theory? Where did all these critters come from? Seems like all at once. So we'll come back to the Cambrian explosion, explain it for old Chuck a little bit later on. He also had the same problem with flowering plants, too, by the way. Flowering plants, according to him, from what he saw, seemed to just appear all at once. And flowering plants are pretty advanced plants. So he's like, where did these things come from all at once? All right, gander on this for a second. This is what a species is. At the very top, morphological. We define a species on the way it looks. This is what you learned back when you were a kid to tell the difference between a duck and a horse. Ducky, horsey, doggy, right? That's very simple to think about. Sure, I got no problem with that. I know if I showed you a picture of a, I don't know, say a penguin. Let's pick another bird just for, and it showed you a picture of an osprey, you would know they're different. Nobody would suggest that, wait a minute, those look like the same bird to me. You know, if I took a picture, or if I showed you a cheetah, and I showed you, let's give it even closer, a lion, or let's use a tiger. They don't live in the same place, but if I showed you side by side, you'd know the difference. You'd say one is one and one's the other. So with one is one and one's the other, we'll go back to our early days as humans. We recognized what a species was. If I held up a picture of a duck, you'd say duck. If I held up a picture of a fish, you'd say fish. That's easy. All right? Sure, it is easy when you're looking on the family tree and you're comparing, you know, this critter way over here with this critter way over here, a duck, horse. But what about when you start looking at different birds? And then maybe when you're looking at different birds, you look at different kinds of ducks. There's more than one kind of duck. And then maybe amongst the duck, there's even different kinds of subducks. And even subducks. See what I'm saying? When you look at morphology, sometimes it becomes a little bit confusing when things are pretty closely looking to one another. Now, I'll show you some examples in just a moment, but let me tell you where we are now in terms of identifying a species. We've done our very best job to try to identify what it is. And if you're thinking, why is that a problem? You're going to find out in a moment why it is. But today, we kind of lump a bunch of things together to call a species a species. Not only the way you look, but the way you work. That's your physiology. Where you came from. Phylogeny is your family tree, basically. Right? We have ways to analyze that. And where you live and what you do for a living. Remember, we talked about the word niche. Niche is what you do for a living. Are you a burrower? Are you a chasing predator? Are you a swimming predator? Right? So we finally come up with a definition. This is the best one we have. This is not a perfect definition because what we're trying to do is we're trying to categorize a dynamic process. Speciation and evolution is a dynamic process. It's always going on. All right? It's kind of like back in mitosis when you're in Bio 1. You learn interphase and prophase and metaphase. But when you look down under a microscope or when you study them more closely, you realize that it wasn't prophase, then metaphase, then anaphase. It's like prophase blended into metaphase. Remember, there was even a prometaphase, right? When I was in genetics, we learned like, I don't know, like 16 different stages to mitosis. You can break it up. It's a dynamic process, and that's what this definition is like. Ernst Mayr, smart dude, 1942, back in 1942, came up with this definition. A species is a population or group of populations whose members have the potentials to interbreed. We've talked about a population before, and we've talked about the fact that interbreed, that's not inbreed. So they can interbreed with each other in nature to produce viable, fertile offspring. That's what makes a species. What delineates it from a species is in red. You cannot be a species is if you cannot produce viable, fertile offspring with another organism. If you're of a different species, two different species, by Meyer's definition, cannot make viable fertile offspring. But if you're of the same species, you produce viable fertile offspring. Okay, fertile means that they can reproduce themselves. Viable means they live. Okay, so if you're a member of the same species, you can get together with another organism, and it's of the same species, you produce an offspring that lives and can reproduce itself. On average. Every once in a while, offspring are born with defects in which that's not possible. Sometimes they die, but on average, you produce a viable fertile offspring, all right? Easy enough. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of examples here. Let's go back to third grade. On the left is the horse, on the right is the donkey. Everybody see that? Now, in the white, in the upper left are the horse, is the horse's scientific name. It's binomial nomenclature. Its genus is Equus, and its species epitaph, or its species name, is Cabalus. We call it Equus cabalus. You may have heard the word before or not. The donkey on the right is in the same genus, Equus. So right away, even though that Linnaeus, when he first came out, said this had nothing to do with kinship. Remember, he started all this Equus and kingdom phylum stuff. So if you're the members of the same genus, Equus and Equus, he said it doesn't mean you're related to one another, right? It just means how you were created. But we pretty much refuted that. If you're in the same genus, you're related to one another. You're pretty doggone related to one another. You might even want to call yourself cousins, if you will. However, even though you're in the same genus, the horse and the donkey are not the same species, are they? See, Cabalus and Asinus, those are two different species. Now, down below, a horse and a donkey can produce an offspring, and they can produce a viable offspring. The way you indicate hybrid, by the way, is you put the X between the two words, so it's Equus cabalus asinus. So down below, these are, well, you guys know what they are. What are these called? What are these organisms down below called? We have a name for these. Yep. And what do we know about mules, Marie? What do we know? They're viable, all right, but what do we know about mules? Or what is unique about mules or different? Can mules reproduce? Can you take two of those down below, a male and a female, those two mules, and can you breed them and produce an offspring? No. Nope, you cannot. Nope, that's right. Mules are born sterile. Mules are born sterile. Yep. So we go back to Meyer. There we go. They produced a viable. Mules can live and can be really strong. I mean, in some cases, they are very strong, obviously. That's why they were bred, because they could pull plows and stuff. But guess what? The offspring wasn't fertile. Meyer's definition doesn't say you have to be one of these. It says you have to be both of these, viable and fertile. So a horse and a donkey are justified as being Cabalus and Asinus as two different scientific names, because even though they produce a viable, they don't produce a fertile offspring. Makes sense, right? Okay, good. Simple enough. Let's look at another example. Same thing. I'm going to take two very common organisms you're familiar with, look at their scientific names, and we'll talk about them being a species or not. There's the dog on the left. Good picture. Good dogs. German Shepherds are good dogs, man. And on the right are their cousins, Canis lupus. Or here in Florida, we're much more familiar with another canine known as Canis latrans. That's the coyote. Canis latrans. So Canis lupus, or it could be Canis latrans. Anyway, you got Canis familiaris on the left. That's your familiar dog. Canis lupus on the right. Now, we all know that dogs and wolves are related to one another, but I wonder how related they are. Well, if we're following Meyer's definition, it looks to me what we got is they produce viable offspring. These are wogs down below, by the way. That's what they're called, wogs. So these are wogs you see down below. The one on the right looks almost like a Malamute. Oftentimes people will do that. They'll breed huskies. That's got to be a husky because they're blue eyes. Malamutes only got brown. They'll breed huskies with wolves in order to get an organism that looks like a husky, but they can tell the difference. It's a wolf. So they produce viable offspring. They produce viable offspring. So right there, you're going, wait a minute. They got two different scientific names to produce viable. But do they produce fertile offspring? Or are they like the horse and the donkey? Do you have any knowledge of that? So is a wog fertile or not? I used to have a friend of mine up in South Carolina that raised timber shepherds, timber wolves and German shepherds mixed together, and he would sell those as guard dogs. He said the amount of wolf that was in the dog was actually very little, but it was a great selling feature. You could tell your neighbors, yes, well, he's not just a dog, he's a wolf. Marie, you don't know if wogs are sterile or not? Born sterile? You never heard that? Yeah, they're not. Wogs are fertile. Normally, there might be some problems that occur, but wogs are fertile. So those critters down below can breed with other wogs and make other wogs. You can make other wogs. You can make other wogs, and so on and so on and so on. So what the heck? We give them two species names, but according to Meyer's definition, they produce. In order to be the same species, you have to produce viable, fertile offspring. And if you're another species, you're not. Well, they got two species name here, but guess what? They produce viable, fertile offspring. So are dogs and wolves the same species? No. And yes. All right, I'll come back to that in just a second. One more example. Also happens out in the wild. It just doesn't happen when we do things like artificial selection, right? Dogs and wolves sometimes breed in the wild too, but if we look at, for example, bottlenose dolphins, that's Tursiops truncatus, and then the false killer whale, Pseudorca crasidens. Tursiops truncatus and Pseudorca crasidens, there's the X between them because they hybridize in the wild. They make this thing that's in the picture, they're called a wolfen. It's actually a part dolphin, part false killer whale. Killer whales and false killer whales really aren't whales, folks. They're really dolphins. They're all related more closely to dolphins than other whales. But in spite of all that, so here we've got members of a different genus, not different species, different genus who are breeding together and making viable. I don't know if dolphins are fertile. I don't think they're fertile. All right, so what we're doing here, what's happening here, the reason why we see these differences, the reason why wogs are born fertile, even though they have different names, and the reason why mules are born sterile, although every once in a while it does happen. Every once in a while a mule is born fertile. Yep, every once in a while a mule breaks the trend and is born fertile. Now, what does this have to do? It has to do with where you are in the family tree. Let's take horse and donkey here for a second. So we got some ancestor, both horse and donkey, that splits. Horse over here, donkey over there. All right, now we are looking at, I sort of drew this into the future actually. Where we are today, when we are looking at horses and donkeys, is we're about right here. In other words, what I'm saying is in this time in history, we're not that far away from when horses and donkeys were the same species. So they become separate species through time, okay? But it hasn't been that long ago. So remembering what I told you about mitosis, this whole process of speciation doesn't occur overnight. You don't give birth and say, boom, there it is, new species. They evolve and change. So Aristotle's really wrong. Not only are there rungs between the ladder, rungs between the rungs, there's rungs between the rungs. There's lots of rungs. There's rungs on rungs, okay? Where we are in the dog and the wolf, same diagram. Here, split, dog, wolf. Where we are here is just past the break. We're just past. Dogs, now here's where humans get involved on this, right? Dogs are domesticated wolves, basically. Humans began to domesticate wolves. Wild wolves, I've heard anywhere between 10 to 20,000 years ago. Now, in terms of evolution, folks, that's yesterday, isn't it? 10 or 20,000 years, man, that's a blink of an eye. That's nothing compared to 3.5 billion years. So what we're seeing here is wonderfully the nature of speciation, of how speciation demonstrates to us that these organisms did come from a common ancestor. Because when you get down very close to the juncture point, you can actually get those exceptions to the rule. The rule is species produce only viable fertile offspring, and you can't do it with another species. Well, sometimes you can. Sometimes you can if you're really close to when they broke apart, to when the branch occurred. Does that make sense? Okay, so now that we've confused and muddied the water of where a species is, I hope you got a better appreciation for it anyway, not confused by it, but understanding that life on Earth is dynamic. It's changing as we watch it. It's just not finished right today. But, you know, given that we can, we're actually more interested in creating species, let's kind of turn our attention to that now. So there's a good flow chart here. And in order to create a species, in order for species to diverge, in order for a population to become different enough that they become separate species, they got to stop doing it. Simple as that. They got to be reproductively isolated. All right, and we break reproductive isolating mechanisms to two types. Those that occur before fertilization, those are prezygotic, and those that occur after fertilization, and those are postzygotic. Think of what you see in this chart here as, say, like a series of hurdles. So we got two individuals on the left of different species. Okay, there's a blue species and the, what is that, yellow species. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow through and see what are the hurdles they have to overcome before they get to the end and do this. And if they do that, if they produce viable fertile offspring, then they are the same species. So this is kind of a series of steps that you go through. Say, okay, is it this? Is it this? And if they clear all these steps, then they are the same species. So we're going to assume from the beginning the blue and the yellow are different species. All right, let's look at the prezygotic barriers first. First one's really easy to understand. It's called habitat isolation. These two species of coastal grasses both have the same genus, so they're close related, Spartina. But the one here in America is Alternifolia, and over there in England is Maritima. Habitat isolation basically means exactly what it says. For the pollen from either Spartina species to drift all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, whether it gets collected on a ship or wherever, the frequency of that happening is so little to zero that those two organisms are going to stay separate species. Now, this is the most feeble of the isolating mechanisms. It's the first one, too. If you keep them physically separated from one another by an ocean, they can't reproduce. The reason why it's feeble is you would want to test this by bringing them together. If you bring them together, those two species, if you go over to England or wherever and you bring it back from there and you reproduce and they produce viable fertile offspring, then they're kind of like the wolves and the dogs again. Their break just occurred. And the break actually historically, this is what I love about bringing together all the different disciplines. Historically, in America, we started seeing Spartina alternifolia. In other words, it started being reported in America soon after the Europeans started coming to America. So soon after Columbus and England and all that sort of stuff started sailing ships to America, that plant showed up there. Interesting, right? Probably came over in the ballast water of the ships, or came over on those ships. Ballast waters, the ships would take in tons of water to keep them stable in the ocean, and then when we get over to America, they would pump the water out and fill it full of resources. That would be the weight that would keep the ship stable. The lower you ride in the water, the more stable you are. So oftentimes, and even today, we'll talk about something later on, when ships get rid of that ballast water, so they pick up this water in England, helps them be stable across the Atlantic. Then they get rid of the water in America. Oftentimes it's got seeds or larvae in there, and that's how a lot of these organisms get spread. Okay? So I'll do one more and then we'll finish for the day because the next one's real easy too. Not all species breed like us. Not all species have what we call a protracted breeding season. In other words, you breed all the time. We don't, it's supposed to be PRO, protracted. We don't reproduce certain times of the year, but that's not the case. You know, organisms come into heat and all that stuff. And like, for example, we look among, 5 different species of closely related frogs that live near each other. So the habitat isolation, we've jumped that hurdle. It's not habitat isolation that's keeping them apart, but what it is on this, it's time. Okay, what you're looking at here is mating activity on the y-axis. So you notice the different species of frogs, their peak mating activity is different from one another. That doesn't mean in late March and early April that a few leopard and wood frogs might get together. And there might be other reasons that prevent them from producing viable fertile offspring anyway that we'll talk about, when we get together tomorrow. But on average, most of them are going to breed during their peaks, right? So if you breed at different times of the year and you live in the same area, it could be the time of the year that you breed that's keeping you separated. So pickerel frogs are only interested in each other sexually right around the end of May, and bullfrogs are only interested in each other sexually towards July. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, that's where I'm going to stop for today. Let me stop the recording.